The Fractal Terra really does remind me of your mum. Compact size, pleasing aesthetics, and it's been run through by every tech YouTuber out there. Mr. Matt Lee, Gamers Nexus, even PC Centric has gone in for some sloppy seconds. But is the Fractal Terra that case, or is it just a bit overrated? To find out, I'm going to come out from behind this water butt and build a brand new personal rig. And I hope you're sitting comfortably, because this is going to be in-depth. In the previous video, I took down my super fancy liquid-cooled system, risking it all to get ITX for my own PC, which I use for business, DaVinci Resolve editing, and a dash of gaming. So here's how this is going to work. Unboxing, case tour, build, the parts used, testing, and then we're all going to be home in time for tea if we pay attention. And all the way through, I'm going to be giving you my advice as to how to get the most out of this case, because it's not always as obvious as it first appears. I've put a lot of time into making this video. It's going to be super in-depth, so stick with me to learn all about the Fractal Terra. Let's have it. So cracking the case open, I got a lovely personalised message from Jeff at Fractal. He's obviously a big fan. So it comes with these cardboard wedges and a cloth fabric cover. Now you might think this is a bit irrelevant, and to a certain extent it kind of is, but these materials are much more sustainable than those big foam blocks and plastic bags that you normally see on PC cases. And for someone that actually does care about sustainability, that is really appreciated. The case is pretty tiny. 22 centimeters tall, which is 5 oranges in freedom units, 15 centimeters wide, 35 centimeters long. And despite this, you can fit some pretty mighty hardware in here. With the right choices, you can get even an RTX 4090 and Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. But as we'll discuss, you'll be making some sacrifices to get there. We're going to talk about that in a bit. The Terra costs 170 quid, including tax here in the UK, which is eye-watering. You've got to really love this design to go for this case, especially when there are other great ITX cases out there for a lot less money. I got mine for £158 at distributor level, and of course I can claim the taxes back, so it's not quite as bad for me. But bear the price in mind throughout this review, because for a lot of people it is going to be a big factor. One of the standout features of this case is the nice wood panelled front, giving a more natural look. Woods seem to be in at the moment, and I'm here for it. It looks pretty sweet. The front panel is nice and minimal. Just got a power button, USB-C and USB-A. I love this more minimal approach. I have no need for front panel audio. I have no need for a reset button, so I'm digging this design. The panels come in black, white and green. They have this kind of matte powder coated feel on them, which looks nice but does collect dust and fingerprints really easily. But when all is said and done, you could just wipe this away with a microfiber cloth. It all looks very professional. To get the top panel off, it's a simple pull toggle and slide off. The sides have this really cool Lamborghini Gallardo thing where the sides roll upwards, and I love that. Sweet as. When you build it, you can leave these sides on actually, but when I did it, I took them off completely using the screws on the side because I just like to have the maximum space available. But let me warn you, putting these back on later is really fiddly, so I'm going to leave that choice whether you do that up to you. Okay, now that we're inside, the fun really begins. The Terra has this movable spine. You unscrew 4 points, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and then you can slide the spine back and forth, and then screw it back down in place once you've got it in the right spot. The whole reason of this is that it gives you more room for either your CPU cooler or your graphics card as needed, giving some impressive flexibility to the setup so you can fit inside the Terra. The Fractal user manual has some really nice charts showing the different configurations that are possible. Sliding the rail to give yourself more CPU cooler clearance means you've got less room for big thick graphics cards and vice versa, so it's up to you to find the balance. You'll also have to consider that the graphics card max length is 322mm. That does mean you have to be careful with your graphics card choices and really check the clearances on Fractal's website. The most powerful system that I deem sensible in this case is a Ryzen 7 7800XD with a 67mm tall CPU cooler and an RTX 4080 Super Asus Pro Art Edition. The reason is the Pro Art series are really nice and slim. They fit within the length constraints and aren't too thick. The MSI Gaming Slim series should also be okay as well. On the Radeon side, you could get a 7900 XTX inside this case, but you'll need to get a very specific model, and from what I could see, it's only the reference model that's actually going to fit inside this case if you want to have a tall tower cooler. Of course, if you want to go for a thicker graphics card, you can do that, but it means you're going to have to get a smaller cooler for your CPU. Of course, any other 2 to 3 slot graphics card that is within this 320mm limit is going to be just fine. For coolers, you can use either a Noctua NH-L12S, which I've done in today's build, or something like a Thermalright AXP120X67. Both of these are awesome and they each have benefits and drawbacks. For pure cooling and value, I would actually choose the Thermalright. That's because it has a downdraft style, drawing air into the case, which will work nicely seeing as it faces outside the case into fresh air. The downside of this setup is going to be turbulence noise. With this kind of slotted side panel that we have on the Terra, the fan noise is going to be higher with this cooler style because of the reverberations through that side panel. The Noctua NH-L12S is an updraft cooler, meaning that it exhausts air out of the case. This could mean that temperatures aren't as good because it's trying to draw air from a small space inside the case. However, I say could because I haven't tested it. Who knows which one is actually better? The definite benefit is that you won't get that turbulence noise with this cooler design, and that's why I chose it for this particular build today. There is space to mount a 2.5-inch SSD on the floor of the case if you really need to. Alternatively, you can put a fan down here as well. It's a tight squeeze though. A 120mm standard fan will go in, but it's tough, and you might want to go for a slim fan instead, especially if you want to put a fan grill on it to protect the blades. This fan is usually best placed as an exhaust fan shooting air out the bottom of the case, but there is an argument to be made for intake in the specific circumstance that you're using an updraft CPU cooler. You can also use the Velcro straps on the interior of the front panel to hold an SSD or two with a bit of tape if you really needed to. This area is also used for cable management. Honestly, I think using a 2.5-inch SSD in here isn't really wise, though it can be done. I just think it's too tight with the power supply and everything all in that area. And speaking of the power supply, that goes here in this mount and it's fed by an extension cord. I managed to fit a Corsair SF1000 1000 watt power supply in here, but it was real tight and it meant that I couldn't put a fan in the bottom for extra cooling. I definitely recommend getting a smaller one for your own builds. Besides, 1000 watts is generally overkill. The only reason I used it today was because I got it on a great deal ages ago. I got it for about £110. The power supply fan should face in towards the motherboard direction rather than the graphics card direction to get a clean supply of air. The motherboard goes on this side as well. Standard mounts, as you might expect, though the motherboard does go in upside down, I suppose. I definitely recommend plugging in all your modular cables and other bits before actually screwing the motherboard down, because it's really tight to get in there and put stuff in afterwards. Because of the movable spine, there is a panel gap at the back, but this is unavoidable with this design. The front panel cables are USB-C, USB 3 and power button, which just hook up to the board as you'd expect. The final piece is the graphics card. As a sandwich style case, it of course uses a PCIe 4 riser. This took me a while to work out, but what you want to do is unscrew these two screws on the riser piece and actually just slide it out or pivot it forward. Then you're going to put your graphics card in, screw it down, and then place that riser piece back inside. The reason for this is, at least when I tried to build it, I couldn't actually tighten the graphics card mounting screws while it's in the case. For some reason I just couldn't get it to work. Maybe I'm just stupid. And with that, we are built up, and the final result is pretty handsome, I'd say. So, it's time for a rundown on the components, and of course some testing. And what else? Oh yeah, we're going to do some undervolting. Let's go. So I wanted to see the best way to optimize my system, so I decided to dabble in some undervolting. So at stock, the temperatures were acceptable but suboptimal. Into the 80s on the GPU and just shy of 90 on the CPU in an all-core torture test. To fix this, I used the MSI Afterburner Curve Editor, and that capped my clocks at 2670 MHz, but at 950 millivolts instead of the stock 1070. So that's less power usage for the same clock speed. For the CPU, I just used a simple curve optimizer in the BIOS. -30, it just wasn't happening, wasn't stable, so I went down to -20 and that was stable. And after all that, we got temperatures of exactly the same. At least in the stress test, there wasn't any difference at all. However, when I ran Superposition Benchmark and Cyberpunk, the GPU temperature was about 6 degrees cooler for the same performance. Whilst the CPU temperature was still high in those tests, the clock speed was actually better, about 4,850 MHz versus the 4,600 I got at stock. Now that's pretty sweet, but did it actually affect the performance whatsoever? Okay, well, here we go. Superposition score, basically the same. Cinebench score on GPU and CPU, basically the same. And in Cyberpunk, we got 124 FPS at stock and 120 FPS undervolted, and I'd say that's within margin of error, let's be real. So lower temperatures, same performance, and arguably, more importantly, way lower power draw. The 4080 Super was using around 290 to 300 watts in Cyberpunk, but with this undervolt, we're sitting at about 230 watts, which is a huge saving. There's less heat into the room, lower power bills and cooler operation. Guys, I suggest that everybody does this. Okay, so we're tested up and we like it. Performs well and the temperatures are acceptable, though not perfect. That's what you get with an ITX system. But what about the parts choice here? Let's go through why I chose the parts and where you might want to choose something different. I want you to bear in mind that I'm using this computer for video editing, gaming and productivity. So if you're a pure gamer, you might choose something different entirely. So the CPU. Ryzen 7 7800X3D. This is the ideal choice for this case, in my opinion. Excellent efficiency, top tier performance without getting too hot. If you need more than 8 cores, you really might struggle in the Terra, and I'd just recommend going for a standard mid-tower, or at least an ITX case that can take a liquid cooler. You might be able to get away with it by undervolting if the small size is non-negotiable, but I wouldn't really recommend it. For DaVinci Resolve nowadays, it's pretty GPU heavy instead of CPU, so I can't see myself needing more than 8 cores for 4K video editing, and through editing this video and a lot of others, I haven't noticed any slowdowns at all. The cooler I used was the Noctua NHL12S. I wanted low noise, so I went for Noctua. The exhaust or updraft design eliminates the side panel turbulence noise, which would have driven me nuts. A good alternative would be the Thermalright AXP 120X67, but if you're on a Ryzen 5 7600 or something equally low power, the stock cooler is also going to work just fine in a pinch. For the motherboard, I used the Gigabyte B650i Aorus Ultra. I do not recommend you get this board. The heat sinks are really chunky, which makes it really hard to mount the cooler, and I would guess that you'd probably get better CPU temperatures on a different motherboard because there's very little space for air to actually get underneath this cooler to be exhausted. I couldn't use the 7mm offset on the Noctua cooler because of the design of these heat sinks, so who knows, I might have got better performance on a different motherboard. So talking about that, why did I bother getting it? Well, it is the only ITX AM5 motherboard that supports 3 M2 SSDs, and I do need all 3. One for the OS, one for project files, and one as a scratch disk. If you do not absolutely need 3 M2 drives, then get something else. The MSI B650i Edge is nice, or even something lower end like the baseline Gigabyte B650i will be just fine. You don't need anything fancy for a Ryzen 7 7800X3D because the power draw just isn't high enough to need that higher end of motherboard. For storage, I always recommend getting DRAM buffered SSDs, or at the very least, get one with HMB on board. It makes a huge difference to your usage. I've reused 2 of my 2TB Gen 4 drives for the old system and added in a 4TB Silicon Power XS70. All of these have DRAM or at least HMB and speeds over 5000 megabytes per second and really good reliability as well. For memory, I wanted 64 gigabytes. That's kind of what I like in my system. It keeps things really snappy when I've got lots of different heavy apps open, but for most of you guys, 32 gigs is fine. I went for Corsair Vengeance because it's low profile, it's going to fit underneath the cooler. And I went with 6000 speed CL30 because that's a real sweet spot for Ryzen. If you're on 32 gigabytes, you might be able to push for a 6400 kit, and it usually works just fine, especially on a 2-slot ITX board, but I needed something really stable to make sure that the computer's not going to crash when I'm doing productivity. Okay, so for the graphics card, Asus 4080 Super Pro Art Edition. We went through the reasons I chose this earlier. It's 4080 Super and it's going to fit inside this case really nicely, and it looks pretty slick as well. Got enough VRAM, 16 gigs is about what I need. It's a nice slim card, it's got good power efficiency, and it looks nice. Could I have gone for a 7900 XTX? Yep, absolutely. But you would need the reference model, and that's actually more expensive, at least here in the UK. I found this card brilliant for crunching through DaVinci Resolve renders and 1440p high refresh gaming, and I get access to NVIDIA's software suite, and the main one I use is RTX Voice, because that can clean up some really nasty audio. For the power supply, I needed something that could power all of this, but for this kind of system, guys, a 750 watt gold unit is absolutely fine, especially if you're going to undervolt. So why do I have a 1000 watt Corsair SF1000L. Well, simply put, I got this for 110 quid about a few months ago, which is actually cheaper than I could now buy a 750 watt unit, so why not go for that? The main downside of the 1000 watt unit is that it is a bit larger. It means I couldn't put a fan in the bottom of the case. So for you guys, the most you're ever going to need in an ITX system is 850 watts, so just stick with that. Okay, so that was an absolute mammoth of a video. Hopefully it helped you learn about the Terra, build in the Terra, decide whether to buy the Terra. Well, whatever it is, tell me in the comments below. You can say thank you, you can say piss off, you can say whatever you want down there. But I really want you to subscribe, and I really want you to tune in next time.